Let's continue with the future of Europe. It's now time for Professor Rahman from the Eurasia Group, who is an expert on risk analysis, to give us his views about Europe and the forthcoming risks.
Thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here in Delphi. At Eurasia Group, we're advising investors on politics and political risk. So we're very often focused on the very short term, what's going to happen over the next 2 weeks, what's going to happen over the next 1 month, next 2 months. So it's actually interesting, intellectually, I think, to think about Europe over the next 5 years and think about some of the challenges Europe is likely to face over the next 5 years. And when I think about Europe between now and 2020, given the current situation, there are really 3 things I'd like to focus on that I think are going to be critical for determining what that evolution is going to look like. The first is Brexit. That's not Grexit, that's Brexit. That's actually what's happening in the UK. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about that and thinking about the ways in which that can impact integration or not over the next 5 years. The second factor I think is very, very important is German power, understanding the nature of German power, certainly in the midst of the current refugee crisis, and how that I think could affect Europe and its trajectory over the next 5 years. And the third factor I'd like to focus on is populism, and specifically populism in Central and Eastern Europe, which is slightly different to the populism we've known in Southern Europe. I think it's more historically grounded, it's more violent, and there's a risk that I think in terms of its impacts on Europe over the next 5 years will be more pervasive than what we've seen over the last 5 years in Southern Europe. So to talk about these 3 factors, I'll start with Brexit. Look, I think there's a strong intellectual consensus that has settled that suggests that Brexit would be a disaster for the EU. It'd be a disaster because it would result in a large number of copycat movements, Eurosceptic strands of opinion in third countries that would then look to emulate what the UK has done as the UK leaves the EU. I actually don't think that's right. I think from our perspective, far more damaging for Europe will be if Brexit does not happen. And I'm going to explore that idea a little bit. I think some of the concessions that are being offered to David Cameron, some of the concessions that are being offered to prevent Brexit from taking place are actually far more corrosive to the integrity of the EU, the integrity of the treaties, and potentially for disintegrative forces in the medium term. So what do I mean? Just to elaborate here. When we think about Brexit and whether it happens, let's work off the hypothesis for a second that it was to happen. You're clearly seeing a big implication for UK assets. We've seen that on sterling over the course of the last 2 weeks. I think as we get closer to the 23rd of June referendum, you're likely to see UK assets suffer further, given all of the prevailing uncertainty that will be brought online. If we think about the UK extricating itself from the EU, Article 50, of course, is very, very ambiguous. I don't think that would be a straightforward process. I think the working assumption in the UK is because we run a trade deficit with the rest of Europe, the Germans and others are going to want to continue exporting cars to us. As a result, we will have access to the single market. I don't think that's right. I think we will only have full access to the single market if we're full members. If you're not full members, there will be an implication for trade that will be negative. I think there's also an assumption on the services side that we'll continue exporting services to the rest of the EU. Also, I don't think that's right. I think Brexit would present a perfect opportunity for the French, the Germans to repatriate the provision of financial services and do so in Frankfurt or another core euro area market. So in terms of the impact on UK assets, in terms of where the UK would end up in terms of goods and services, none of this strikes me as positive. I think this would all be very, very negative for the UK. I don't think other states that are looking at the UK example would necessarily, from that experience, say, we want to emulate that experience, that's something we want to achieve. If you think about the counterfactual, if the UK stays in, what are the implications for the rest of Europe? As I say, I think they're far more negative. Cameron achieved a deal last week in Brussels. In achieving that deal, he did one thing immediately. He undermine the ideological pillar that has sustained European integration for the last 50 years, ever closer union. There is now a carve-out for the UK on ever closer union. In so doing that, I think Cameron may have made it harder in the future for other countries to contemplate the kind of treaty change necessary, for example, to make things like the euro area work. I mean, the euro area is not working. For it to work, you're not looking at a small transfer of power to the centre, you're looking at a fundamental transfer of sovereignty to institutions in Brussels. That's what we are looking at. The question I have is whether the UK's deal and the opt-out from ever closer union now makes it harder for publics in other countries to contemplate ceding that kind of sovereignty to make the euro area or the EU work. It's not clear. The second thing I would point to is the impact of the deal on the Conservative Party. They're clearly not happy right now. The numbers are around 160 MPs. That's half of Cameron's parliamentary party. That's not looking to support staying in the UK. They want Brexit. So they're not happy with Cameron's package. My point here is if treaty change does happen at some point in the future, it's very likely the UK is going to again come back and ask for even more concessions, even more opt-outs. So that's my point. I think ultimately keeping the UK in and the concessions necessary to keep the UK in are far more damaging to the integrity of the treaty than if the UK were to leave. And I'm happy to explore that idea more in the Q&A. That's my first point. My second point on German power and the nature of German power. Look, I think here, Angela Merkel, clearly vulnerable. I don't think she's as vulnerable as a lot of the Anglo-Saxon press in the UK would make out, but there's no doubt that the refugee crisis is a big problem. You can't solve the crisis with German money, that's obvious. The resolution is not really internal to Europe, frankly speaking. It depends on two people. It depends on Erdogan in Turkey, and it depends on Putin in Russia. These are the two actors Germany needs to get on board if this refugee crisis is going to be resolved at its root causes. And of course, one can have a debate about Erdogan, one can have a debate about Putin, but I would say the stars are not aligning in a positive way. So Merkel is vulnerable. We have federal elections next year in 2017. The extent to which this matters, Merkel vulnerability, the elections next year, is really dependent on whether you believe German power today in Europe is structural or Merkel dependent. And that's really the question internally within Eurasia Group we've been trying to stress test and figure out, because that I think will be very important thinking about the future of Europe over the next 5 years. Those who think it's structural would argue German power in Europe works through the European People's Party in Brussels. It's pervasive through the institutions, and through those institutions, German policy preferences are realized. They will also point to things like economic strength. I mean, Germany's still going to perform higher than the euro area average this year. And they will also look at the other, let's say, constellation of big states in Europe and their leadership and argue there's a big deficit between those folks and the rest of and Germany. I think Cameron clearly has a very defensive agenda. The French are weak, not really focused on the EU conversation. The Poles have scored a tremendous own goal with the election of peace. They're not really having a positive effect on the debate at EU level. And in Italy, I think Renzi is doing stuff. But clearly, the country is struggling with a large number of macroeconomic challenges, and I don't think these guys are anywhere near as competitive or as influential as Germany. So this supports the idea that German power is structural. At the same time, of course, there are examples where Merkel and Merkel's personal agency have been very, very important for policy, and there's no better example for that than Greece. I think I don't say anything fantastical if I argue that last year, if Schäuble had been the Chancellor, Greece would not be using the euro today. I think that's correct. So personal agency, of course, does matter, as do institutions and structural power. The question I guess I'm asking is, what's the balance of those two things? How can we get comfortable with the extent to which Merkel does or does not matter when we're thinking about Germany's future over the course of next year and the implications for that for the rest of Europe through 2020? So that's my second point. My third point is on populism in Central and Eastern Europe. I'll be very quick here. Look, I think what we're seeing in Central and Eastern Europe is, on some levels, we're seeing strands of Euroscepticism that are very pervasive. They're historically grounded. They come from two things. One, I think, is the perception that the transition from communism to capitalism was botched. That's one piece of it. And the second, that the EU accession process for a lot of these countries was also botched. So you've got that historically contextualized populism that's now converging with anti-austerity and, of course, opposition to refugees. And that, in its implications, I think both domestically but also for Europe, are very profound. Domestically, you're seeing serious democratic rollback of institutions in a number of countries in Central and Eastern Europe. Hungary is the example. Obviously, Poland, I think, is following in that direction. So for these two markets, in terms of their institutions, that's a big, big concern for investors. But also at EU level, I think the debate is much more toxic as a result of some of the populism you're seeing in Central and Eastern Europe. This is the awkward squad. Right, I mean, Slovakia does not agree with the EU's refugee policy. It doesn't simply opt out. It challenges the policy in the European Court of Justice. So I think we need to, there's not enough attention being paid to the implications of populism in Central and Eastern Europe and the implications that populism carries for the European Union and EU integration going forward. I think it's much more pervasive and very different from what we've seen in Southern Europe over the last 5 years. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you.